An army stopped mid-charge, not from fear, not from confusion. In full sight of their enemies, 22,000 veterans halted on an open plain, caught their breath, straightened their lines, and then charged again. No order was given. None was needed. That single moment, an entire army stopping itself without being told to, tells you everything you need to know about what Julius Caesar had built, and why the largest Roman army ever assembled couldn't stop it. Contemporary records document the force waiting across that field. 45,000 infantry, 7,000 cavalry, the resources of half the known world, commanded by the man called Pompey the Great. Caesar's men had already been defeated 6 weeks before. They were exhausted, undermanned, and fighting on foreign soil. And they were outnumbered at the critical flank by 7-1. So what did Caesar do? He hid 3,000 men behind his own cavalry and told them to aim for people's faces. But here's what historians have never fully answered. Pompey the Great, the man who cleared the Mediterranean of pirates in 40 days, who held 3 consulships and 3 triumphs, who had been called Magnus by his own troops before he was 30 years old, knew something was coming on that flank. His cavalry commander, Titus Labienus, had spent a decade inside Caesar's mind as his senior legate. They understood exactly how Caesar thought. They saw the trap being set. They advanced anyway. And when the cavalry broke and the catastrophe became visible from his own command position, Pompey didn't draw his sword. He rode back to his tent, sat down, and waited. The chronicles document the behavior. They never explain it. You'll discover that the weapon which broke 7,000 of the finest cavalry in the ancient world wasn't superior numbers or a brilliant maneuver. It was a specific instruction to aim javelins at riders' faces, and the precise psychological calculation behind it recorded in Caesar's own hand. You'll learn that the first man to physically strike the Pompeian line was a retired soldier who had already finished his military service and came back by choice, and that his last words to Caesar were a promise to earn his gratitude, whether living or dead. And you'll find out that when Caesar entered Pompey's command tent after the battle, the tables were already laid for a victory feast. Wine poured, laurels hung. The celebration prepared before a single sword had been drawn. To understand why the greatest general of his era sat in his tent while his army died, we need to go back 18 months, to the moment Pompey made the one decision that set everything that followed in motion. Rome in 60 BC was 500 years old and running out of the political architecture that had kept it together. The Republic, the system of shared power, rotating magistracies, and Senate authority that had governed Rome since the kings were expelled, had been designed for a city-state. It had never been designed for an empire. And by the middle of the 1st century BC, it was straining under the weight of conquests it couldn't govern, armies it couldn't control, and generals who had become more powerful than the institutions meant to contain them. 3 men had emerged from this fracture as Rome's undeniable powers. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome; Julius Caesar, the most dangerous politician Rome had ever produced; and Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, the most decorated soldier in Roman history. At his absolute peak, Pompey was something Rome had never seen before. He had destroyed the Marian forces in Africa before he was 25. He had crushed the Sertorian revolt in Spain. He had eliminated Mediterranean piracy, a problem that had plagued Rome for generations, in 40 days, using a coordinated naval campaign that modern military historians still study as a logistical masterwork. Then came the Eastern campaigns. Mithridates defeated, Syria annexed, Jerusalem entered. He was awarded 3 triumphs. Those rare ceremonial marches through Rome, granted only to generals who had won wars, not merely battles. And he had been called Magnus the Great by his own troops in Africa before he was 30. Plutarch records that Pompey accepted this extraordinary title with apparent modesty, while privately considering it no more than his due. The 3 men, Caesar, Pompey, Crassus, formalized their dominance in 60 BC through what historians call the First Triumvirate. It was not an official government. It was a power-sharing arrangement between men who had individually accumulated more influence than Rome's institutions could contain, and who understood that their competition was destroying them separately when it could benefit them together. It worked imperfectly for 7 years. Then Marcus Licinius Crassus rode east in 53 BC to fight the Parthians, seeking a military glory to match his partners, and died at Carrhae, with most of his army around him. The arrangement had always been a triangle. Remove one corner, and it collapses. With Crassus gone, Caesar and Pompey looked at each other across Rome's political landscape and saw not a partner, but a threat. Caesar's decade in Gaul had transformed him from a brilliant political operator into something more dangerous, a general with 10 years of unbroken campaign experience, legions that worshipped him personally, and personal wealth accumulated from the plunder of an entire civilization. The Senate, dominated by the conservative Optimates faction, saw his growing power with rational alarm. One man was not supposed to hold this much. The Republic's entire architecture was designed to prevent exactly this. Their response was a legal ultimatum. Surrender your command, return to Rome as a private citizen, and face prosecution for your actions during your consulship and the Gallic campaigns. Caesar's enemies in the Senate were specific about what came next: political destruction, financial ruin, possible exile. Pompey was their instrument. He had the armies, the reputation, and now the political alignment with the Senate. He had been married to Caesar's daughter Julia, a genuine political alliance that had softened the rivalry. But Julia had died in 54 BC. The last personal bond between the 2 men died with her. Pompey stood before the Senate with characteristic confidence and made a pronouncement that Plutarch preserved. In whatever part of Italy he stamped his foot upon the ground, armies of infantry and cavalry would spring up to serve Rome. He had raised armies before. He would raise them again. He was right about almost everything, except about one thing. What Caesar had built in Gaul was not an army that followed orders. It was a brotherhood that followed a man. And the difference between those 2 things would decide the world. The Rubicon was a small river. In January of 49 BC, it was also the legal boundary between Caesar's province of Cisalpine Gaul and Italy proper. To cross it with an army was treason. To cross it without an army was suicide. Julius Caesar was 51 years old when he made his decision, and he had been making impossible decisions since he was a young man on Sulla's prescription list, a list of men to be killed for their political associations. He had talked his way off it. He had navigated the most dangerous political environment in Roman history for 30 years, accumulating enemies and surviving them, making alliances and outlasting them, betting everything on his own judgment at each turn. His survival instinct was not recklessness. It was pattern recognition at extraordinary speed. Ancient sources suggest that Caesar may have suffered from epilepsy, what Romans called the falling sickness, though historians debate the nature and frequency of his episodes, and accounts vary significantly between sources. What is not debated is what this condition meant for a Roman general. His enemies used it to question his fitness for command. His men, who had watched him fight, apparently decided the question answered itself. The decade in Gaul, from 58 to 50 BC, had done something to him that no amount of political maneuvering could have achieved. More than 30 major engagements. The Siege of Alesia, where he simultaneously besieged a Gallic army and built fortifications to hold off a relief force larger than his own army. The Rhine crossings, the expeditions to Britain, not militarily decisive, but strategically audacious. The kind of move that tells an army their general will attempt anything. His men had been hungry with him, cold with him, victorious with him, and occasionally nearly destroyed with him. Their loyalty was not to Rome, not to the Senate, not to an institution. It was to a person. His defining tactical qualities were two Latin words that the World History Encyclopedia and contemporary military historians both identify as his signatures: celeritas, speed, and improvisum, surprise. He consistently made decisions faster than his enemies could process them. The Ilerda campaign of 49 BC, 40 days to neutralize the entire Pompeian force in Spain, produced one of the most quoted lines in Roman military history. Going to fight an army without a general, he told his officers, and would return to fight a general without an army. He was right on both counts. The Rubicon crossing in January of 49 BC was pure celeritas applied to politics. The Senate expected him to cross in spring, when weather was predictable and military movements traditional. He crossed in winter under cover of darkness, with a single legion, before any organized resistance could form. He descended into Italy so fast that Pompey, with his famous boast about stamping armies from the ground, chose not to test it. He evacuated Rome. He evacuated Italy. He sailed for Greece with the Senate in tow and left Caesar in possession of the capital without a significant battle. Caesar later characterized this as Pompey's critical error. The moment a war that might have been fought in Italy became a war that had to be fought across the Adriatic. But there is a harder reading of the same moment. Pompey had more men. He had more resources. He had the wealth of the eastern provinces and the loyalty of client kingdoms from Greece to Judea. His plan was rational. Let Caesar exhaust himself, gather overwhelming force, and return to finish the war from a position of absolute superiority. The plan almost worked, which is what made Pharsalus necessary. By the summer of 48 BC, Pompey the Great commanded the largest Roman army ever assembled, and it was slowly becoming his greatest liability. The force gathered in Greece was genuinely formidable on paper. 45,000 Roman legionaries. Most of them assembled from the eastern provinces, where Pompey's decades of campaigning had left him with vast networks of loyalty and obligation. 7,000 cavalry drawn from every corner of the Mediterranean world. Galatians from central Anatolia, Thracians from the Balkans, Macedonians, Gauls, Germans, horsemen from Syria and the Levant. The UNRV historical database characterizes Pompey's auxiliary force as representing more client kingdoms and allied peoples than any Roman commander had ever united under a single standard. 12 or more petty kings and despots under Roman influence in the East had sent contingents personally. What the numbers obscured was the problem underneath them. These men had never fought together as a unified force. Their loyalty ran to their own commanders and their own kings, not to a Roman general most of them had never served under. The professional cohesion that Caesar's Gallic veterans had built over a decade of shared experience. The ability to stop mid-charge without orders, to trust the man beside you with your life because you had literally done exactly that 30 times over, simply did not exist in Pompey's coalition army. And the army was not Pompey's only liability. The men who traveled with the camp were. Ancient sources, including Cassius Dio and Appian, document what the Pompeian headquarters had become. A traveling political theater populated by former consuls, senators, and members of Rome's most distinguished families, all of them convinced the war was already won. They were arguing about post-war appointments. Who would get which provinces? Which magistracies would be awarded to which allies? Cato the Younger reportedly refused to take a military command, saying it was inappropriate for a man of his political standing to serve under Pompey in what was essentially a political conflict. The certainty of victory had become an assumption, and assumptions in military camps are always dangerous. Pompey himself had become cautious in ways that his earlier career had not predicted. The man who had cleared the Mediterranean of pirates in 40 days now favored a Fabian strategy: constant pressure without decisive engagement, wearing Caesar down through supply interdiction and geographic attrition. UNRV military historians and multiple modern analysts agree this was tactically sound. His men were less enthusiastic about Fabius than about glory. His senators were categorically opposed to anything that prolonged the war and their absence from Rome. There was also the matter of his cavalry commander. Titus Labienus had been Caesar's senior legate in Gaul, the second best general in Caesar's army, a man who had designed and executed some of the most difficult operations of the Gallic campaigns. When war broke out in 49 BC, Labienus defected to the Republic. His reasons have been debated by historians, but the result was clear. Pompey now commanded Caesar's own teacher against Caesar's own students. Labienus knew every tactical instinct Caesar had. He had watched Caesar build the legions that would face him at Pharsalus. He was exactly the man to lead the cavalry arm that Pompey intended to win the battle. What made the situation extraordinary, and what military historians have noted ever since, was that Caesar also knew Labienus's mind. They had worked together for years. Caesar knew how Labienus thought, what he would see on a battlefield, and how he would deploy the tool Pompey had handed him. Before a single soldier moved at Pharsalus, two former partners were playing a tactical chess match across an open plain, each using the other's own training against them. Pompey had everything: numbers, resources, political legitimacy, cavalry dominance. He had the approval of the Senate. He had the moral authority of fighting for Rome's constitutional order. He had an army twice the size of Caesar's, with 7 times the cavalry. The only thing he lacked was men who had spent 10 years learning how to lose and keep fighting. The Senate's fleet commanders in the winter of 48 BC were waiting for spring. That was when armies crossed the Adriatic, when the weather was predictable, the winds cooperative, and the mathematics of naval interdiction most favorable. Nearly 200 Pompeian war galleys were anchored at Corcyra, sealing the passage. Caesar was trapped on the Italian side with 11 veteran legions and nowhere to go. He sailed in January, under cover of darkness, using transport ships rather than warships. He slipped past the Pompeian fleet anchored at Corcyra with 7 legions and approximately 20,000 men, making landfall near the village of Palaeste on the coast of Epirus. According to the Warfare History Network's detailed reconstruction of the campaign, the crossing took roughly 15 hours, through winter waters, past the strongest naval concentration Rome had ever assembled in the Adriatic. The fleet commander, Marcus Bibulus, woke to find his enemy already ashore on the wrong side of the sea and immediately blockaded the port Caesar had just vacated. Caesar was now in Greece, but he had left 4 legions behind. Mark Antony, Caesar's most trusted lieutenant, the man who had managed Rome in Caesar's absence and crossed his own political crises to remain loyal, was stranded in Italy, with the remainder of the army. The Pompeian fleet, belatedly energized by its failure to stop Caesar's initial crossing, now threw everything into preventing reinforcement. For weeks, Caesar held his position in Epirus with 7 understrength legions, writing increasingly urgent dispatches back to Antony. The situation was not merely dangerous. It was the kind of military isolation that ends careers and armies. Then Marcus Bibulus died. The Pompeian fleet commander had maintained his blockade through winter conditions of extraordinary severity, apparently driving himself to exhaustion through the effort. He died at his post, of frustration and overwork, as ancient sources recorded, leaving the naval interdiction disorganized and under collective leadership that lacked his personal intensity. Britannica's account documents that the resulting confusion in the blockade finally gave Antony his opening. In March, 4 more legions crossed the Adriatic and linked up with Caesar near Epirus. The army was whole. This is the period that produced one of the campaign's most specific and human details, preserved in Caesar's own account of the Dyrrachium siege. His men, cut off from reliable grain supplies by Pompey's superior position, had been reduced to making bread from a wild root called chara, grinding it into a rough paste, baking it on the embers of campfires, and eating something that bore only an academic resemblance to bread. The specific documented use of this chara bread was remarkable. Caesar's soldiers baked it, marched to the Pompeian lines, and threw it at Pompey's sentries through the fortifications. The message was explicit. We can live on nothing. You cannot starve us out. Pompey, according to ancient sources, ordered the incident kept quiet. If his own men heard it, their confidence, already the problem the chara bread was meant to address, would suffer. Caesar had crossed the Adriatic in winter, past 200 warships with 7 legions. He had kept his position for months while outnumbered and isolated. He had survived the blockade. He had demonstrated, for the benefit of every Roman watching, that the rules of military possibility did not apply to him in the way they applied to other people. Now came the siege, and the siege would produce the defeat that made the victory possible. The military logic behind Caesar's decision at Dyrrachium was either brilliant or insane, depending on which ancient source you read and which modern historian you ask. Pompey's army, significantly larger than Caesar's and resupplied by sea through the port at Dyrrachium on the modern Albanian coast, occupied a strong coastal position in the spring of 48 BC. Caesar's response was to attempt something that had never been done in Roman military history. He began constructing a circumvallation line, an encircling system of fortifications around an army larger than his own, with its back to the sea. The completed system, according to the reference source documentation, stretched over 15 miles. Caesar was laying siege to an army he could not defeat in the open field, from the outside. Pompey, for his part, constructed his own counter-fortifications inside Caesar's lines. The two armies spent months building walls at each other across a narrowing no-man's land, exchanging skirmishes, burning each other's outposts, and fighting over individual sections of trench in a proto-siege warfare that ancient sources describe as unlike anything either army had previously encountered. Then, in July of 48 BC, Pompey found the weak point. Caesar's circumvallation line was simply too long for his army to hold everywhere simultaneously. Pompey broke through near the coast, inflicting close to 1,000 casualties on Caesar's forces and forcing a chaotic retreat from the siege works. It was, by any honest military measure, a defeat. Caesar's own characterization, preserved in his account of the Civil War, was the most honest thing he wrote about himself. Pompey could have ended the war that day had he known how to win. It is worth pausing on that sentence. Caesar, who wrote about himself in the third person and constructed his commentaries partly as political propaganda, was acknowledging in print that his enemy had held the winning move and failed to play it. Military historians, including those cited in the Phase 2 research for this script, have generally agreed with Caesar's assessment. Pompey's failure to pursue aggressively after Dyrrachium remains one of the debated decisions of the ancient world. What made it crucial was what it revealed about the Pompeian camp's psychology. Cassius Dio records a detail that is small and humanly significant. After Dyrrachium, Pompey assumed the title of imperator, the honorific given to a victorious general, but pointedly refused to hang laurel on his fasces, the ceremonial bundle of rods that marked his authority. His explanation, as Dio preserves it, was that he was disinclined to show exultation over the downfall of citizens. Pompey, even in victory, remembered that the men he was fighting were Romans. The senators in his camp had no such reservation. They celebrated. They made plans. They told each other the war was essentially over. Caesar marched east. He was beaten, undersupplied, and operating in hostile territory. Thessalian towns that had pledged loyalty to Pompey were now weighing their options with the practical calculus of people who had seen what happens when you back the wrong side. Gamphi was the first to discover Caesar's answer. The town refused to open its gates. Caesar took it by storm and allowed his soldiers to plunder it. The political message was immediate and widely understood. Neutrality was not an option, and refusing Caesar was more dangerous than accepting him. But the deeper consequence of Dyrrachium was psychological, and it ran in two directions. Pompey's army had won a genuine tactical victory and was now filled with the confidence of men who believed the hard part was over. Caesar's army had been beaten, had marched in defeat through hostile countryside, had eaten wild roots and thrown them through fortifications as a demonstration of contempt rather than admit they were hungry. They had survived being defeated. That distinction between an army that had never lost and an army that had lost and kept going would matter enormously on the plain of Thessaly. Pompey followed Caesar east. The senators demanded it. For 7 consecutive mornings in early August of 48 BC, Julius Caesar marched his army out of camp and deployed it for battle on the plain of Thessaly. And for 7 consecutive mornings, Pompey kept his army on the high ground near his camp and declined. The tactical logic was impeccable. Pompey held the elevated position. Caesar had openly acknowledged he would not attack uphill against a prepared enemy with superior numbers. Every morning, the armies formed up. Every evening, they returned to camp. Nothing happened. The stalemate was Pompey's strategy working exactly as designed. Caesar could not force a battle on unfavorable ground, and Pompey had no need to leave his advantageous position to seek one. What the tactical logic could not account for was the political environment inside Pompey's camp. Britannica's account, drawing on multiple ancient sources, describes the atmosphere among the senators and commanders accompanying Pompey's army as increasingly intolerable. They accused him openly of deliberately prolonging the war, not from tactical prudence, but from a desire to maintain his own command and remain the indispensable man. Some already called him Agamemnon, a taunt implying he wanted to be king of kings rather than a Roman commander with constitutional obligations. They were making lists, provinces to be awarded, magistracies to be distributed. One officer was already reportedly arguing about Caesar's personal house in Rome, which he intended to occupy after the inevitable victory. The war was over in their minds. Only Pompey's caution was preventing them from going home to claim their rewards. The UNRV historical analysis is blunt about what followed. A military decision was made for political reasons. On the morning of August 9th, 48 BC, Pompey ordered his army down from the hills. Caesar was actually in the process of striking his camp tents. He had been preparing to march elsewhere, perhaps to seek better supply lines, perhaps to draw Pompey into a pursuit on more favorable ground. When his scouts reported the Pompeian army descending onto the plain, he immediately countermanded his own orders. His engineers knocked down the camp walls and filled the defensive ditches so his troops could deploy without obstruction. According to Plutarch's account, Caesar turned to the officers around him and said, "The day has come when we shall have to fight men, not hunger." Both sides prepared to engage the following day. Plutarch's account of the mood in Pompey's camp that final evening is worth considering. The senators believed they were hours from vindication. The Republic's legitimate authority, commanded by its most decorated general, was about to destroy a rebellious proconsul who had defied constitutional order. The mathematics were simply too favorable for any other outcome. 45,000 against 22,000. 7,000 cavalry against 1,000. Everything the Senate had gathered, the wealth of the eastern provinces, the loyalty of client kingdoms, the manpower of the Roman world's most prosperous territories, was present on that plain. Somewhere in that same camp, the tables were already being set for the victory feast. And in Caesar's camp, across the plain, a retired centurion was checking his gladius. Dawn on August 9th brought the kind of heat that announces itself before sunrise. The Thessalian summer had been brutal for weeks, dry, still air, dust that coated the back of the throat, the sun at full force by mid-morning. The armies that assembled on the plain of Pharsalus that morning were already sweating before the first order was given. Both sides deployed in the traditional Roman formation. The triplex aces, 3 parallel lines of infantry cohorts with cavalry on the flanks. The most reliable fighting organization Rome had developed over 5 centuries of warfare. It was the arrangement every Roman soldier trained for, the formation every Roman general defaulted to, and the framework within which Pompey had designed his winning move. His cavalry was the centerpiece of that move. Titus Labienus commanded 7,000 horsemen on Pompey's left flank. Galatians, Thracians, Macedonians, Gauls, Germans, a polyglot force whose diversity was less important than its sheer mass. Behind them stood thousands of archers and slingers, light troops whose effectiveness depended entirely on the cavalry's ability to create the space and disorder that made ranged weapons lethal. Pompey's right flank was anchored on the Epirus River, whose steep banks made it impassable for cavalry and thus immune to flanking. Every unit of offensive striking power was concentrated on the left. The plan was textbook and sound. Labienus would launch the cavalry against Caesar's 1,000 riders on the right flank. Sweep them away through sheer numerical weight. 7-to-1 odds made the outcome effectively certain. And then wheel left to hit Caesar's infantry in the flank and rear, while the main Pompeian line held the frontal pressure. A veteran army, attacked simultaneously from front and side, historically breaks. This was how battles were won. Caesar, according to his own commentaries on the Civil War, recognized the plan immediately by examining how Pompey had arrayed his cavalry. His response was the tactical improvisation that military historians from antiquity to the present have studied as one of the most intelligent battlefield decisions in ancient warfare. He thinned his 3 main battle lines. His veterans could spread further without losing their fighting integrity. Only troops who had trained together for years could maintain cohesion in a thinned line, and Caesar knew his men well enough to trust them with it. Then he pulled 6 to 8 cohorts, approximately 2,000 to 3,000 of his best soldiers, from his third line and positioned them behind his right-wing cavalry at an angle that placed them out of Pompey's direct line of sight. This was the quarta assis, the fourth line, an additional formation that appeared in no Roman tactical manual created specifically for this battle on this morning. He briefed them personally. Caesar's instruction, recorded in his own account of the battle at chapter 89 of Book 3 of the Civil War, was precise and psychologically specific. Do not throw your pila as you have been trained. Use them as thrusting spears. When the cavalry charges and you emerge, aim for the eyes and faces of the riders. His reasoning, which he also recorded, was a calculated assessment of who was sitting on those horses. Many of Pompey's cavalry were young aristocrats, equites, members of Rome's second highest social class, men who cared deeply about their physical appearance and who had not been hardened by years of grinding campaign warfare. A javelin aimed at the body could be absorbed by armor. A javelin aimed at the face could not. The resulting fear would be faster and more complete than anything a standard infantry charge could produce. His third line, the strategic reserve, fresh troops not yet engaged, was given equally specific instructions. Hold. Do not move until Caesar's personal signal. They were not a backup in case things went wrong. They were the killing blow, held in reserve until exactly the right moment to deploy them. Caesar had built a trap with 4 layers. What he needed now was someone to spring the first one. He didn't have to be there. That is the fact that distinguishes Gaius Crastinus from every other figure at Pharsalus. And that makes his story the most human document the battle produced. He was a volunteer, a man who had completed his military service, earned his discharge as primipilus of the 10th Legion, the highest enlisted rank available to a Roman soldier, the senior centurion of the senior cohort in Caesar's most trusted unit, and then came back. Caesar recalled him when the Civil War began. Crastinus chose to answer. The primipilus was not merely a senior sergeant. He was the pivot point of an entire legion's fighting capability. The man who led the first cohort into combat, who set the standard of personal courage that the men behind him measured themselves against, who knew every soldier in the unit by name and grievance and capability. When Caesar placed Crastinus in command of 120 hand-picked volunteers from the 10th Legion's first cohort and positioned them at the very front of the battle line on the right wing, he was not honoring a beloved veteran with a ceremonial post. He was placing the deadliest man he knew in the most dangerous position on the field. The exchange between Caesar and Crastinus before the battle began is documented independently in Caesar's own commentaries and in Plutarch's Life of Caesar. 2 separate accounts, written by different men with different purposes, agreeing on the substance of what was said. Caesar was riding along his front line when he reached Crastinus and called to him directly. "What are our hopes today, Crastinus? How does our confidence stand?" The centurion's answer, as Caesar recorded it in Book 3, Chapter 91. "Follow me, my old comrades, and display such exertions on behalf of your general as you have determined to do. This is our last battle, and when it shall be won, he will recover his dignity, and we our liberty." Then, turning directly to Caesar, "General, I will act in such a manner today that you will feel grateful to me, living or dead." Plutarch's version, drawing from independent sources, has Crastinus reaching out his right hand toward Caesar as he spoke, adding, "You will conquer gloriously today." The Warfare History Network's detailed reconstruction of the battle notes a specific physical detail from the ancient sources. Crastinus advanced without a shield, his gladius in his right hand, his centurion's staff, the vinewood swagger stick that marked his rank, in his left. No shield, on an open plain. about to lead 120 men in the first infantry contact of the largest battle in Roman history. His entire existence in that moment was committed to one direction. He led the charge. He fought with what Caesar describes as extraordinary fury. He pushed deep into the Pompeian line. He was killed by a sword thrust through the mouth, fighting heroically by a sword stroke in his face, in Caesar's exact words from chapter 99. He had made his promise in the morning. He had kept it by midday. After the battle, Caesar ordered Crastinus given heroic burial rites and had an altar erected in his honor. According to Appian's account, Caesar personally declared himself in the centurion's debt, a statement notable enough that a second ancient historian preserved it separately from Caesar's own account. And decades later, the poet Lucan, who despised Caesar and everything Pharsalus had produced, still remembered Crastinus by name, cursed him in the Pharsalia for being the hand that first stained Thessaly with Roman blood. Both Caesar and his enemies remembered the same man. That is as close to historical verification as the ancient world gets. What followed the opening signal was not supposed to happen. Standard Roman infantry doctrine called for both lines to advance toward each other across the intervening ground, building momentum toward the central collision that would decide who held the field. The psychological advantage of a running charge, the sound, the weight, the controlled fury of men who had committed to a direction, was something Roman commanders cultivated deliberately. Generals on both sides of every Roman battle understood this. Pompey understood it so well that he chose to eliminate it. His tactical advisor for the infantry engagement was Gaius Triarius, one of his naval commanders, and Triarius had proposed something counterintuitive. Order the Pompeian infantry to stand completely still and receive Caesar's charge rather than advancing to meet it. His reasoning, documented in Caesar's own account at chapter 92 of Book 3, was precise. First, Caesar's men, forced to cover twice the expected distance at a sprint, would arrive tired and disordered, their initial charge spent. Second, stationary troops absorb pilum throws more effectively than troops in motion, because they can use their shields as a stable defensive wall rather than catching the impact mid-stride. The plan was to let Caesar's veterans exhaust themselves running across an open plain in August heat, and then cut them down when they arrived winded. Caesar's men crossed the midpoint of the plain, running hard, raising the battle cry that Roman doctrine prescribed, and then stopped. Without orders, without signals, without anything except the collective realization, spreading through 22,000 veterans simultaneously, that the men across the field were not moving to meet them. Caesar's account records this with a clarity that makes it remarkable even 2,000 years later. His soldiers halted spontaneously at roughly the halfway point, caught their breath, dressed their ranks, and resumed the charge. The move Triarius had specifically designed to exhaust them had been neutralized by 10 years of shared battlefield experience. Men who knew their bodies, trusted their commanders, and understood instinctively what the tactical situation required. Pompey's stationary line held as the infantry finally collided. The impact Caesar describes was not the rapid shattering that a successful charge produces, but the grinding close-quarters combat of two roughly matched infantry forces locked together. Shields pressing shields, gladi working at the gaps, neither side breaking cleanly in the center. Pompey's Syrian and Spanish legions in the middle of the line were holding. Caesar's veterans were pushing but not breaking through. The battle would not be decided in the center. Both sides knew it. On Pompey's left, Titus Labienus gave the signal the entire Pompeian strategy had been building toward. 7,000 cavalry surged forward. Caesar's 1,000 riders, always outmatched by 7-1, always intended to be sacrificed, were pushed back, giving ground steadily, exactly as expected. The Pompeian horsemen began fanning out northward, extending past Caesar's flank, beginning the wide arc that would bring them around behind the Caesarian infantry. Pompey's plan was unfolding with textbook precision, for approximately the time it takes to draw a slow breath and release it. Pompey was winning the Battle of Pharsalus. Then Caesar gave the signal. 3,000 men emerged from behind Caesar's cavalry. They had been invisible to the Pompeian line, positioned at an angle behind Caesar's own horsemen, shielded from observation by the main battle formation and the movement of the cavalry fight. They rose and charged directly into the mass of Pompeian riders, not with the overhand throw of trained legionaries releasing pila at distance, but with them leveled forward as spear shafts, aimed at the one thing no armor fully covered: the human face. Caesar's account at chapter 93 is one of the most vivid passages in Latin military literature, and it was written by the man who designed the maneuver. They instantly rushed forward and charged Pompey's horse with such fury that not a man of them stood, but all wheeling about, not only quitted their post, but galloped forward to seek a refuge in the highest mountains. The account's brevity is its own drama. No elaboration, no boasting. Just the blunt fact of 7,000 riders broken by 3,000 foot soldiers. The psychological mechanism Caesar had calculated worked with a precision that might seem almost too neat if it were not independently corroborated by Plutarch and Appian. The Pompeian cavalry, designed to overwhelm through mass and momentum, encountered opponents who were not retreating, who were not disordering under the charge, and who were driving metal at their faces. The arithmetic of the engagement, 7,000 against 3,000, ceased to matter when the men who held the numerical advantage began turning their horses toward the mountains rather than pressing the attack. Fear, as Caesar had assessed it, proved faster than discipline. The archers and slingers positioned behind the cavalry, thousands of light troops whose survival depended entirely on the cavalry screen in front of them, were suddenly exposed on an open plain with no protection. Caesar's account disposes of them in a single phrase: cut to pieces. The fourth line did not slow down. Having broken the cavalry and destroyed the light troops, they wheeled left, a 90-degree turn executed by heavily armored infantry who had just run across an open plain and fought a cavalry engagement in August heat, and struck the unprotected flank and rear of the Pompeian infantry. At the same moment, Caesar released the signal for his third line, the strategic reserve. The troops he had held deliberately uncommitted through the entire opening phase of the battle. Fresh men entering the fight precisely when the Pompeian line was absorbing pressure from front, flank, and rear simultaneously. Caesar himself confirmed the arithmetic of what had happened, writing in chapter 94. He had not been wrong when he declared to his soldiers that victory would have its beginning from those 6 cohorts. They had routed the cavalry. They had destroyed the archers. They had surrounded the left wing of Pompey's infantry. And he had said this to them in advance, not after. The prediction recorded before the battle, rather than reconstructed to explain the result. Pompey's infantry attacked from 3 directions, with no cavalry supported and no reserve to call on, began to come apart. Somewhere on the left wing, Pompey watched his cavalry disappear toward the mountains. Ancient sources, including Caesar's own civil war and Plutarch's Life of Pompey, are consistent on what happened next, though they differ in the detail and emotional register with which they record it. Pompey was positioned on the left wing, close enough to the cavalry operation to watch the 7,000 riders his strategy had centered on break and run. What happened inside him at that moment is not something the historical record documents with certainty. What it documents is what he did. He rode back to his camp. Caesar's account is clinical and brief. Pompey, seeing his cavalry routed, despairing of the result, quit the field and retreated to his camp on horseback. Plutarch, writing from different sources with a biographer's attention to psychological detail, adds texture. He described Pompey as riding back as if he had lost all sense. An ancient Greek idiom suggesting a kind of stunned removal from reality. Not cowardice, exactly, but the cognitive shutdown of a man whose entire mental model of the situation had just ceased to correspond to what was in front of him. He had built his battle plan around one premise. The cavalry would sweep around the flank. Thus, the infantry would hold the center, and Caesar's outnumbered veterans would be destroyed between two simultaneous pressures. Every other element of the battle, the stationary infantry tactic, the archers behind the cavalry, the weight of numbers in the center, was subordinate to that premise. When Labienus's 7,000 riders broke before 3,000 foot soldiers, it was not merely a tactical reversal. It was the elimination of the premise on which everything else depended. The plan had not failed at the edges. It had failed at the core. Pompey sat in his command tent. The Pompeian camp still had defenders. The battle outside was still being decided. And Rome's most decorated general sat in his tent while history walked toward him. UNRV's account of this moment draws on the ancient sources to note that he seemed to be waiting. Though for what, the sources do not say. Perhaps for the battle to resolve in some form he had not anticipated. Perhaps for the moment to become explicable. Ancient sources do not record him making any further military decisions inside that tent. They record him sitting while Caesarian troops scaled the camp ramparts. At that point, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus removed his paludamentum. The paludamentum was the red general's cloak, the scarlet garment that was the unmistakable visual marker of supreme Roman military command. Every soldier on every side of the field would have known it on sight. It was not merely clothing. It was identity, rank, and authority made fabric. Pompey took it off and exchanged it for the plain clothes of a common soldier. He slipped out through the back gate of his camp with a small group of attendants. He did not draw his sword. He did not attempt to rally the legions that were still fighting and dying for the republic he had been appointed to defend. He did not fall upon his own sword, as Roman tradition prescribed for a general whose army was destroyed. He had gone into that battle as the man called Magnus. He left it as a man in borrowed clothes, riding through the back gate of his own camp while the battle cries of his enemies echoed off the hills. 3 decades of military glory, 3 triumphs, 3 consulships. The name that made client kings reach for their tribute. Reduced to a man trying not to be recognized as himself. An army without a general does not immediately stop fighting, but it stops believing it can win. The Pompeian infantry in the center and on the right wing had been doing exactly what Pompey's plan required, holding the frontal pressure from Caesar's veterans, absorbing the grinding close-quarters combat of the main engagement. They had not broken. They were still fighting. But the men on the left flank could see what had happened to the cavalry. They could see the 4th line wheeling toward them. They could see fresh Caesarian troops. The 3rd line, soldiers who had not been engaged, men who had not yet spent themselves in the summer heat, advancing toward their front while the flank attack came from behind. Caesar's account at chapter 94 is precise about the sequence. New and fresh troops came to the assistance of the fatigued, and others made an attack in their rear. Pompey's men were not able to maintain their ground. All fled. A rout in ancient warfare was not a fighting withdrawal. It was a dissolution, the moment when the psychological calculus of individual survival overrode the tactical obligation to hold position. Men threw down their shields because shields were heavy and you could run faster without them. They discarded their pila, their swords, anything that slowed movement or identified them as soldiers, rather than as one more desperate person trying to reach the hills before the cavalry that had not been routed caught up with them. UNRV's account notes that Caesar's orders to his men during the pursuit were specific and deliberate. Spare Roman citizens who offered no resistance. He called it out to his soldiers as they advanced. It was not mercy in the conventional sense. It was politics in the shape of mercy. Every Pompeian prisoner taken rather than killed was a potential recruit, a potential ally, a potential vote in the post-war political landscape Caesar was already constructing. Despite the heat, despite the exhaustion of a battle that had stretched through the morning into the full fury of an August afternoon, Caesar drove his veterans to take the Pompeian camp before dark. The fortified camp would serve as a rally point for surviving soldiers if left uncontested. Caesar understood this the way he understood everything on a battlefield. Immediately and completely, he personally exhorted his men to one final effort. The camp's garrison, primarily Thracian and auxiliary troops left behind when the main army moved onto the plain, offered limited resistance. The Pompeian legionaries who reached the camp were too broken to organize a defense. Caesarian soldiers scaled the ramparts and fought their way inside, while Pompey was still in the process of leaving. Caesar entered the Pompeian command area and found what the UNRV account describes as a camp arranged to receive an elegant feast. Tables laid with food, silver and gold vessels prepared, officers' huts decorated with laurel and ivy. The victory celebration that the senators had been discussing that morning, that this evening, after the inevitable result, they would finally be able to eat properly and sleep in Rome's glory, had been physically assembled, waiting for winners who would not come. Caesar's exhausted, bloodied, summer-scorched soldiers began eating the food. As the light turned gold over the Thessalian plain, Caesar walked among the dead. There were a great many of them. Caesar's own account at chapter 99 provides the official figures. Approximately 15,000 of Pompey's men killed, 24,000 taken prisoner, 9 legionary eagles captured, the sacred silver standards that no Roman legion surrendered while men still lived to defend them, each one representing the complete destruction of a fighting unit. 180 unit standards taken in addition to the eagles. Caesar himself reported his own losses as roughly 200 soldiers killed and 30 centurions, a figure that Britannica explicitly characterizes as improbably low, noting that modern historians treat it with significant skepticism. The real Caesarian toll was almost certainly higher, though the true number has not survived. What is beyond dispute is what lay across the field at sunset: the bodies of Rome's governing class. Among the Pompeian dead were former consuls, serving senators, members of the most distinguished families in the Republic. The men who had been arguing that morning about which provinces they would govern were now distributed across the plain of Thessaly in the attitudes that sudden, violent death produces. Caesar walked among them, and Plutarch and Suetonius both preserve, in closely matching accounts, what he said when he reached them. His words, as recorded in multiple independent ancient sources. Well, they would have it thus: after all I had done, I, Gaius Caesar, would have been condemned had I not sought help from my army. The statement has been analyzed by historians for 2,000 years. It contains, simultaneously, a genuine grievance, a political justification, a moment of human recognition, and an extraordinary self-awareness about what had just happened. Caesar understood that he had crossed a line at the Rubicon that morning in 49 BC. He understood that crossing it with an army was the act that had made this plain necessary. And standing among the bodies at sunset, he expressed neither triumph nor regret, but something more complicated. A man who had made a choice that led here, acknowledging the cost of it. Among the living prisoners brought before him that evening was Marcus Junius Brutus. Caesar had given specific orders before the battle. If Brutus was captured, he was to be treated with honor and brought to Caesar personally. The reason, as ancient sources note and as the research for this script documents, was personal. Caesar had conducted a long relationship with Brutus's mother, Servilia, and had considered the younger man with something approaching paternal attachment. Brutus surrendered. Caesar pardoned him immediately, restored his status, and eventually elevated him to positions of trust and responsibility. 14 years later, on the 15th of March in 44 BC, in the theater of Pompey, Brutus drove one of the 23 knives into Julius Caesar. The body of Gaius Crastinus was found among the dead, identified and separated from the others. Caesar ordered heroic burial rites and the construction of an altar. Of all the deaths at Pharsalus, 15,000 Pompeians, an unknown number of Caesarians, 30 centurions named collectively and one named specifically. Caesar honored one man above all others with a permanent memorial. The retired soldier had promised gratitude, living or dead. Caesar made sure it outlasted both of them. He had 30 horses when he left his camp and fewer when he reached the coast. Pompey's flight from Pharsalus was not the organized, strategic withdrawal of a general regrouping for a future engagement. Ancient sources consistently describe a man in motion without a clear destination, making decisions under duress that would have been unthinkable to him 48 hours earlier. He traveled fast, discarding attendants and resources as he went, driven by the awareness that Caesar's cavalry would be following, and that every hour spent stationary was an hour in which his options narrowed further. He reached the coast. He found a merchant vessel. He sailed first to Lesbos, where his wife Cornelia, daughter of Metellus Scipio, who had commanded Pompey's center at Pharsalus, had been kept away from the campaign. Plutarch's account of the reunion is one of the most humanly devastating passages in ancient biography. Cornelia collapsed weeping when she saw him, and Pompey reportedly told her that the fortune she had known was gone, and that she must now share the fortune that remained. He convened a war council with the survivors and advisors who had gathered around him. 3 options were seriously considered: Africa, where Pompeian sympathizers held territory; Parthia, the great Eastern empire that had destroyed Crassus and which might be interested in sponsoring Rome's legitimate government against a usurper; and Egypt, where the young King Ptolemy the 13th held power after his father's restoration. A restoration achieved partly through Roman intervention during Pompey's years of Eastern dominance. Pompey chose Egypt. The reasoning was not obviously wrong. He had relationships with the Ptolemaic court extending back years. Egypt was wealthy, militarily capable, geographically distant from Caesar's immediate pursuit, and nominally in Rome's debt. History hits analysis of the decision notes that Pompey sent messengers ahead to announce his approach, standard diplomatic protocol that, in this specific case, gave his enemies the one piece of information they needed to prepare. What Pompey did not know was that Egypt in the autumn of 48 BC was itself in civil war. The teenage King Ptolemy the 13th was fighting his sister and co-ruler, Cleopatra the 7th, for control of the kingdom, and the real power behind the throne was held by 3 advisors: the eunuch Pothinus, the general Achillas, and the tutor Theodotus of Chios. When Pompey's advance messengers arrived, these 3 men convened a council to determine how to respond. Their logic, preserved in Plutarch's account, was the cold mathematics of realpolitik. Welcoming Pompey meant potentially making him a power in Egypt and antagonizing Caesar, who was obviously going to win the civil war. Sending him away meant making him an enemy without the protection of his goodwill. The solution, as Theodotus reportedly summarized it to the council: dead men do not bite. The specific assassin selected was Lucius Septimius, a Roman officer who had served under Pompey himself during the eastern campaigns of the 63 BC era, a man Pompey would recognize. According to Wikipedia's account of Septimius, he had remained in Egypt after those campaigns as part of a mercenary garrison, the Gabiniani, Roman troops who had stayed in Ptolemaic service, and was by 48 BC a leading figure in the Egyptian court's military establishment. He knew his target. His target would trust him. On the 28th of September, 48 BC, a small boat came out from the shore at Pelusium to meet Pompey's vessel. Pompey's advisors on the ship saw the fishing boat first, and they did not like what they saw. The reception party was minimal. 3 men in a small craft, where diplomacy and genuine welcome would have sent a more substantial delegation. Pompey's wife Cornelia, watching from the ship's deck, was frightened. His advisors urged him to withdraw, to put back out to sea, to wait for a more convincing display of Egyptian hospitality before committing himself to a small boat heading toward an unfamiliar shore. The argument was sensible. Everything about the situation suggested caution. Pompey recognized one of the men in the fishing boat, Lucius Septimius, a former officer, a man he had fought alongside in the East, a Roman face in foreign service. The recognition was apparently enough to override his advisors. He stepped out of his ship and into the small craft. Plutarch's account of what followed is among the most precisely detailed death scenes in ancient biography, and multiple independent ancient sources corroborate its essentials. As the boat neared the beach, close enough that Cornelia, still watching from the ship's deck, could see clearly, Septimius drove his sword into Pompey's back. Achilles and a centurion named Salvius added their daggers. According to Plutarch, Pompey drew his toga over his face with both hands and said nothing. He made no sound, showed no fear, performed no final act of defiance. He pulled his garment over his face and died as a Roman, which was to say, with the forms observed, whatever the substance had become. Cornelia's screams reached the ship from the shore. History Skills account notes that her husband's body was dumped into the shallow water near the beach while the assassins removed his head. A freedman named Philip, one of Pompey's household servants who had accompanied him to Egypt, gathered driftwood from the beach and built a makeshift pyre. He burned the body of Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, 3-time consul, 3-time triumph holder, the man the Roman world had called great since before he was 30. On a sand beach with scavenged driftwood, without ceremony, without witnesses of consequence, without the honors that Roman law prescribed for a man of his status. The head was preserved separately, placed in a basket, and transported to the Ptolemaic court. Caesar reached Alexandria on the 2nd of October, 48 BC, 4 days after the murder. The boy king's advisors presented their gift. Ptolemy, the 13th's court, had expected Caesar to be pleased. Plutarch records that Caesar turned away. He wept, an act that ancient sources generally preserve without fully explaining, noting the ambiguity between genuine grief and political performance. He reportedly said, "This was not what I wanted. Whoever tells me that I should rejoice in this does not understand me." What Caesar wanted, and what he had been pursuing since Pharsalus, was a living Pompey who could be publicly pardoned. The same clementia he had shown Brutus, the same calculated generosity that converted enemies into obligations. A dead Pompey was merely a closed chapter. A pardoned Pompey was a demonstration that Caesar's power was generous enough to forgive the man who had fought hardest against it. The Ptolemaic court had given Caesar a severed head instead of a political asset. He had Pompey's signet ring. He had the head of the man who had been his son-in-law, his partner in the triumvirate, the friend of his middle years who had become the instrument of his nearly fatal destruction. He had, in the most complete possible sense, won. He wept. The chronicles record it. They do not fully explain it. Pharsalus did not end the civil war on August 9th, 48 BC. This is the distinction that the battle's historical legacy most frequently obscures. And it matters for understanding what Pharsalus actually was. The fighting continued. Cato the Younger and Pompey's sons, Gnaeus and Sextus, fled to Africa and Spain respectively, raising new armies and new causes. Caesar spent the following months fighting for his life in Alexandria, embroiled in an Egyptian dynastic conflict that had nothing to do with Roman politics, but which Caesar himself had triggered by demanding repayment of debts and refusing to leave after Pompey's death. The war in Africa ended only at the Battle of Pharsalus in 46 BC. The last organized Pompeian resistance died at the Battle of Munda in Spain in 45 BC, more than 3 years after Pharsalus. But Pharsalus broke the spine of the Republican resistance in a way that Thapsus and Munda were merely confirming. What the battle destroyed on August 9th was not an army. Armies can be rebuilt, as Cato and Pompey's sons demonstrated. What it destroyed was the premise that the Senate's constitutional authority, backed by the resources of the Roman world's wealthiest provinces and commanded by its most decorated general, could outweigh the loyalty of veteran soldiers to a single commander. That premise had never been tested at this scale before. The result was definitive. The political consequence was immediate and cascading. As Wikipedia's account of the battle's aftermath documents, drawing on ancient sources, former Pompeian allies began aligning with Caesar almost immediately after the news spread. Some because they believed the gods favored him, the ancient world's version of backing the obvious winner, and others through the simple calculus of self-preservation. The network of client kingdoms and dependent states that had been Pompey's greatest resource. The relationships accumulated through 3 decades of Eastern campaigning transferred their political loyalty to the new power with the speed that political loyalty always transfers when the balance shifts decisively. Caesar's response to victory was the most politically sophisticated use of military success in Roman history. His clementia, the clemency he had shown Brutus at Pharsalus, was extended systematically. He pardoned former Pompeian officers. He allowed senators who had fought against him to return to Rome and resume their careers. He offered Cicero, who had not been at Pharsalus but had supported Pompey, the same restoration of status. In deliberate contrast to the prescriptions of Sulla, who had solved his political opposition problem by publishing lists of men to be killed and their property seized. Caesar chose to make his enemies into his dependents, rather than his corpses. The honors accumulated. Dictator for 1 year in 49 BC. Dictator for 10 years in 46 BC. Dictator for life in February of 44 BC. He refused the title of king when it was offered or rumored. The title that would have made the autocracy too legible, too offensive to the Roman cultural identity that had expelled its last king 5 centuries before. But as history skills documents, he accepted extraordinary powers and titles that accumulated to something functionally indistinguishable from kingship without using the word. The Senate that had ordered his destruction in 49 BC was ratifying his permanent supremacy in 44 BC. The institutional body survived. The institution it had housed. 500 years of collective governance, of power shared among families and rotated through offices designed to prevent any single man's dominance, did not survive Pharsalus. Everything that killed Julius Caesar began in Thessaly. The connection runs directly from the plain of Pharsalus, where Caesar had pardoned the men who would later organize his murder. Through every policy decision and every accumulated honor of his final 2 years. To the theater of Pompey on the 15th of March, 44 BC. The location is historically documented and has been noted by historians across 2 millennia as the kind of irony that reality occasionally produces with a precision that fiction would hesitate to attempt. Julius Caesar was stabbed to death in the building named for the man whose army he had destroyed at Pharsalus. Marcus Junius Brutus was among the conspirators. So was Gaius Cassius Longinus, who had also fought against Caesar in the Civil War and been pardoned. Both men had been elevated by Caesar after Pharsalus. Brutus to positions of particular trust, as the research for this script documents, given Caesar's personal connection to the man. The conspirators numbered approximately 23 senators. Caesar received 23 knife wounds. The correspondence is documented. The mechanics of the actual assassination, which took place in a crowded space with multiple participants, make clean accounting difficult. What is not disputed is that Brutus struck at least one blow. That Caesar, according to Suetonius and Plutarch, covered his face with his toga as the attack became overwhelming, and that he died on the floor of the theater of Pompey. The conspirators believed they had restored the Republic. They were catastrophically wrong about almost everything that followed. Caesar's 18-year-old grandnephew and heir, Gaius Octavius, was in Macedonia when the assassination occurred. He came back to Rome, accepted Caesar's name and inheritance, fought the last round of civil wars, and by the year 27 BC had become Augustus, the first Roman emperor. With a power so thoroughly consolidated that the Senate's role had become primarily ceremonial. The republic that Brutus and Cassius killed Caesar to preserve had already ceased to function as a governing system at Pharsalus. The assassination settled who would rule the resulting empire, not whether there would be one. The tactical legacy of the battle runs through military history as a foundational text. Simon Shepard's Osprey military history study of Pharsalus identifies it as one of the defining case studies in ancient tactical innovation, specifically the fourth line as an illustration of reserve doctrine, and Caesar's instruction to aim for the faces of cavalry as an early documented example of deliberately targeting psychological vulnerability rather than physical capability. Military historians from the Renaissance to the present have studied the Pharsalus campaign and the specific problem of defeating numerically superior cavalry with creative infantry deployment as a problem that recurs across different technologies and eras. The principle that cohesion defeats numbers, that experienced troops who trust each other can neutralize advantages that should be insurmountable, is documented at Pharsalus as clearly as anywhere in military history. The World History Encyclopedia's characterization of what Pharsalus ended is worth stating plainly. The battle ended the 500-year history of the Roman Republic and launched the 500-year history of the Roman Empire. One battle, under an hour. A plain in Thessaly, in August heat, where 22,000 veterans demonstrated that what men will die for matters more than how many men you put in a field. Caesar was dictator for life for exactly 1 month before the Ides of March. He never had the chance to discover what came after everything he had won. His veterans, the men who had stopped mid-charge on a Thessalian plain without orders and then charged again, were scattered by then across the empire he had built. They would serve the nephew who inherited everything. They would fight Augustus's civil wars. They would watch the Republic buried in the ceremonial language of senatorial procedure, while the real power sat in a single man's hands, exactly as it had at Pharsalus. Most of them were probably not surprised. The plain near Pharsalus in central Greece is farmland today. The Epirus River still runs through Thessaly, its banks reduced by 2,000 years of silting from the steep sides that made it impassable to cavalry on the morning of August 9th. There is no monument on the specific site of the battle, partly because scholars still debate the precise location, with John Morgan's 1983 archaeological study placing it north of the river near modern Crene, while other historians favor ground closer to modern Pharsala. The town of Pharsala exists, continuous with ancient Pharsalus across 21 centuries, but it does not mark the field where the Republic died. History marks it instead through consequence. Let those numbers sit with you one more time. 22,000 veterans against 45,000 soldiers. 1,000 cavalry against 7,000. A force that had already lost its last major engagement on foreign soil in summer heat against the largest Roman army ever assembled. And in under an hour, Caesar's men, by the rout of cavalry, the destruction of archers, the flanking of infantry, and the methodical exploitation of the one thing numbers cannot buy, which is a decade of knowing the person beside you, destroyed that army so completely that 9 of its legionary eagles were taken. Now return to the question the intro raised. Why did Pompey sit in his tent? The answer that military historians and analysts of warfare have offered, and that the pattern of the entire campaign supports, is not that Pompey lost his courage. He had displayed genuine courage throughout his career, and the record does not support cowardice as an explanation. The answer is that he lost his model. Caesar's men had not fought for Rome, not for the Senate, not for constitutional legitimacy, not for any of the institutional reasons that Pompey's entire career had been built on mobilizing. They fought for a person. A man who knew their names, shared their food, called their centurions out of formation by name before battle, and had spent a decade demonstrating in the most concrete possible terms that he would not ask them to do anything he had not already done himself. Pompey commanded an army. Caesar had built a family. When the family broke the army, Pompey had no framework for understanding what he was looking at. The institution that had made him Magnus could not survive the encounter with something more personal, more durable, and more willing to stop mid-charge on a burning plain, to catch its breath and straighten its lines, and then charge again. The Battle of Pharsalus lasted less than an hour. The world it created lasted 500 years. And somewhere in the scholarly literature of every military institution that has studied it since, from the Renaissance condottieri, who read Caesar's commentaries as tactical manuals, to the staff colleges that study reserve doctrine today, the lesson that 3,000 hidden men, aimed at the right moment, at the right faces, can end 5 centuries of collective governance, has never fully gone away. Caesar built an empire with it. His heir inherited the empire. Brutus tried to undo it and made it permanent instead. And somewhere in the theater of Pompey, on the 15th of March, in the building named for the man whose cavalry broke on a Thessalian plain, the last person to understand what Pharsalus had actually decided was the man bleeding on the marble floor, covered by his toga, surrounded by the faces of men he had once pardoned.